In this presentation, actually, we are going a bit back. I mean, we're just focusing on the thinking behind what it is zoning, mostly for veterinary health. So, what is the outline? I will start with what are zones for veterinary health, what means modeling zones, and then going to the case study, as Nicola was saying this morning. So, why model zones? Let's start with a little scenario. So we have a country, just a random country with a few farms. Now see if okay, one of those farms become positive, let's say for a random disease like influenza, and then without zoning, all of the country it becomes like an infected zone. So what that means? It means that if you want to move poultry production, poultry products, or poultry in general, that will not be possible. Same scenario, we apply what it is called zone. In this case, we have very small infected area, the red one, with a small buffer around that, meaning that you have some more measures to limit the spread of the disease. In this case, the scenario also for trade is quite different. So just from the infected farm, you cannot export poultry products. For the other part, you could be able to export. So actually, trade continuity is one of the scope for which you have to apply zoning, but it's not the only one. There are some more related to outbreak control, like disease control in this case, having some idea of the epidemiological risk, having some idea of where the disease is, so you can contain the outbreak, and you have a few of the measures there. But also, it can be used for operational efficiency, meaning that you know where the disease is, and then you can focus your efforts in that area, so you can actually improve your budget allocation, for example. And of course, zoning is what ties all of these action, all of these meanings. As Paolo was saying this morning in the chapter 4.4 of the terrestrial code, there is a definition of a few zones. Actually, they're not the only zones present in the code, in the manual, sorry. And there are some more in the specific chapters for the disease. But actually, the four main zones are the free zone, actually just a single zone where you don't have any case. You have an infected zone where the disease is present. Containment zone, meaning it is an infected zone larger than an infected zone, normal infected zone that contain more outbreaks. It is used to contain the disease. And there are protection zone, which is a free zone that has some measures that are used to avoid the incursion of disease. Let's say the definition against some real world, let's say. And in this case, the EU framework for Rabies disease. So free zone, they're actually not described in the EU legislation. They are taken for granted when you don't have any case. It is considered like a free zone, but there's no definition of the zone. Infected zone, actually we call them protection zone. I think it is the 3 kilometers radius around the case, and that's one of the first things. We have further restricted zone that can be more or less associated with the containment zones. And then we could try to, let's say, accumulate a surveillance zone with protection zone. They don't have the same meaning. So you see those alarm sign, meaning that especially for protection zone, they are completely different meaning, and there can be some kind of miscommunication also when transmitting data to the war. So going to the part of modeling zones. What are zones? Zones essentially they start as a concept, an epidemiological concept, a very simple concept. For example, proximity to outbreak, or species distribution, or again environmental features or movement. And then to the concept you add some logic. For example, all farms within 10 kilometers, or areas with high density of fattening turkeys, areas located in proximity to wetlands, or farms that are connected to the same feed mill through vehicles. But adding logic means essentially what Vittorio showed and what also Fernando showed is are logics that help you to define the zones. And logic can be actually risk factors, for example, either one of those or a combination of those, because I'm not going through all of the risk factors for having influenza, it will be quite long. Or can be disease dynamics. We saw R0 or R0 or whatever, and the critical community size, all concepts related to the disease dynamics that can help you to define or add some logic to the zone. But also, of course, you have a standard dynamic, but you also have to take into account the evolution of the dynamics and the possible other hosts that can be affected or involved. Or you can have some legal threshold. In this case, it is the animal health law from Europe. They say that you should have a 3 kilometer zone around the farm for protection zone and a 10 kilometers. So you have the infected farms and you have the two zones. And those zones that are just logic associated with concept can be then translated into something more, let's say, manageable and actionable. That is something related to what it is called geometry or geography. And adding geography, or geometry in this case, is the next step. So we have a logic related to a concept, can be very simple, can be complicated at all. And then we have transition into geometry. What does that mean? Meaning adding or associating some spatial polygon, for example, some spatial object that can be, let's say, human-made, like buffers, or can be related to administrative levels. The combination of the two allows to have this operational use. So you have areas that are actually actionable. So you can use those areas to enforce some measures. But also, once you have the files, you can store the file and you can share the file. That is what Matteo was saying this morning, the communication, the core of the GEOZONE project. Okay, but what makes a zone a zone? We said a zone is partially delineated. We have a polygon, you have administrative boundary. It is interpretable. You know what zone means, why you have done these zones, and then you can interpret the scope of the zone. The link to measures, you don't have any zones without measures. Otherwise, what is the reason of having a zone? You have a structural validation. This is something related more to the technical aspect. For example, what you do if you have overlapping zones, for example, something like that. It should be legally validated. Actually, not all of the zones are legally validated, but still, normally they are. And then they can be communicable because you have files that they can share with other institutions. Okay, so we have our logic flowchart for creating zones. Once you have the zone model, you have the geometry associated to the zone, you have the operational tool, the one that you use for transmitting data. You can use those zones in those like a key use case, or those key user can use those zones. But actually, what help actually the key user to communicate to each other is what it is called interoperability. It is essentially what Matteo was saying this morning. It's a very, not very easy concept for us, veterinary at least, but essentially just using some consistent schemas, some shared formats to speak the same language, actually. So, jumping to the case study, a small, let's say, context for avian influenza in Italy. This is in northern Italy. All of those points are poultry farms divided into different poultry production type. Actually, the map or the numbers are not very recent, let's say, but we have more than 3,300 farms in this area, which is more than 70% of the national production. Then we have this map. Also, this one is a very, very old map that Vittorio has provided us in 2000 something. This is the density 20 years ago, the density of mallards in northeastern Italy. If you compare, if you compare the two maps, you can see we have essentially the same, where we have high density poultry production in area with lots of mallards, and mallards are one of the reservoir for avian influenza. It's kind of suicidal, but actually something what happens. And this is actually what happens indeed. So we have just the Veneto region in here, and you can see the cumulative number of cases between 1999 2023, and by epidemic. Essentially, the same zone is always affected when we have avian influenza. So we have this situation, and we start with a concept. We should draw some areas that take into account density of migratory aquatic birds, ducks and gulls, and also areas that have high density of poultry farms. So those are the basic concepts behind the definition of our zone. And then we add some logic, like risk factor in this case. Those are risk factors present in some ministerial decree. We didn't use all of them, but most of the risk factor is also the one that Vittorio was explaining. Plus we consider, of course, density and possibility of contacts between farms. And we very naively actually use those risk factors to create like risk maps. Those are very, very simple risk maps that actually we used. And we have like density of farms weighted for the production type, distance to wetland as a proxy for the presence of wild birds. Then we have elevation because it is considered one of the strongest risk factors, but I guess it is more related with the ecology of ducks. The distribution of past outbreaks, and then combining all together, just shaking a bit, we have these final results, meaning that we have area in blue that are a very low risk level for avian influenza. In yellow is like a kind of middle level, and in red a high level of risk. And we transform this into something more easy to understand and easy to manage, which are those areas. So we have those type of areas, we call them Zone A and Zone B. And what is the meaning of those areas? So what is the interpretation of those areas? So we have Zone A is zone at high risk of virus introduction. So it is where you are expected to have the first introduction, let's say, of avian influenza. And then we have Zone B, in which you have high risk of introduction, but also high risk of spreading the disease. So that is the interpretation. Finally, we have the legislation. In this case, I was talking about the Veneto region. We have a regional legislation that is approval of those. What's the point? Okay, here we go. So Veneto region, we have the approval. Hopefully, I will not. Anyway, the approval of those areas as a legal framework for the validation of the areas. And those zones we have measures. I'm not going through the measures, of course, because it is not the scope of the meeting. But as you can see, we have measures, different measures for the different two areas. So going back to the logical framework that we were talking about earlier. So are the zones spatially delineated? Of course they are. So yes, let's check. Are they interpretable? Yes, they have kind of a simple interpretation. Those are areas at risk of introduction and the spread. So also that one is checked. Are they linked to measures? As I just showed you, there are measures for every type of area. So again, they are structurally validated. We have one of the best GIS office.
Thank you.
So it is validated, kind of, let's say. It is legally validated because we saw the legislation. It is communicable because everything is stored in files or in system, and then they can be shared quite easily. So it is validated. So good for us. Those are actually zones that can be actionable, and they are actionable, and they can be communicated. So this is a typical example of the flow chart to reaching zoning, official zoning. Okay, last section, wrap up. So the message that I want to give you, essentially, the main message is that a zone is not just a polygon, it's not just a shape, it is actually a decision. You have to go through all of these steps to define a zone. You have to have the epidemiological logic for defining a zone and everything else. Oh, there it is. Good models, good zones are structured because you have the logical framework, shareable, as Matteo was saying this morning, and traceable, meaning that you should be able to trace the zone in time somehow. So having this kind of versioning, let's say, or knowing when the zones are closed and when new zones are opened. And the last one is modeling zones. In this case, not epidemiological modeling or mathematical modeling. Is modeling the zone is a kind of bridge between the expertise, the epidemiological expertise, and the enforcement, meaning the policymakers, the decision makers. Zoning tomorrow, what how we are going to to try to face. Actually, this is more of a dream than a real framework for next research. Of course, better tools, meaning integrated platforms that allow you to model directly on the web, for example, and directly validating zones and sharing zone, building logic checks, meaning that actually zone created by themselves once you input some logics. User-friendly interface, which is more for us veterinarians, which are not very technical sometimes. Real-time updates, like as I was saying, versioning, knowing every day if the zone is open or not, for example. And finally, data integration. So that is like a container of all of this information that can be managed and integrated to create new zones. And that was my last question. If you have any question.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo, for the clear explanation about the difference between war and EU, about the naming of the zone. So, in your view, what do you think needs to happen to solve this, or we just live with these names?
Well, thanks for the question. We were talking about just yesterday, something that could be useful could be some kind of trust coding dictionary. I mean, for a country what a zone is, the name of the zone, for war what zone is. You need some kind of translation in the middle that was automatically translate one zone into the other one, and that could be shared with war without any problem at all. So it's just a step more added to the logical framework, essentially.
When you have to choose a zone regarding a disease, general disease, um, it's better in the most of the cases to choose an area like a region regarding the shape of the area, like a region or I don't know a province, or draw manually the area to focus better on the problem, the disease.
Actually, there are pros and cons for the both of the options. I mean, if you use like administrative boundaries, it will be much easier for communication, essentially more at the center level, for example, because you just have the whole municipality or the whole province, for example. But actually, that is against the ecology of the disease normally. So administrative boundaries, meaning official boundaries, are easier to share. Let's say, drawn boundaries should be more useful from an epidemiological point of view, because you should take into account the distribution of a species, for example, or I don't know, corridors or whatever. So it's actually, it depends on the scope of your zoning. I mean, if I should like draw a risk zone for starting or for applying some particular controls probably, and not be shared anywhere else, I mean, I would probably go for the handmade one.
Thank you, Paolo. Can you go back to your last slide?
This one?
The future. How much do you think is feasible in practical perspective to have that integration, these real-time updates, and having interoperability between systems, etc.? Because actually something we are facing as well at the international level, to have some interoperability between systems is a huge problem. Also because, well, when you are inside the country something, there is a lot of variability between countries, etc. So if you can comment on it.
Yeah, it could be feasible in long term, actually. It's something that should be built step by step with the central authorities having the, let's say, patronage of ministry or something like that. it is not something that a single people or a single institution can do. So it should be feasible if the integration between different groups is stronger. So not very easy then.
Other questions? Okay, if you could rank, from the most problematic to the things that it's more easy to consider when you planning a zone, which are the elements that's considered that can create problem for you to organize a zone? Can be the absence of the the user-friendly interface to guide zone creation, or can be missing information such as restocking, or can be problem about the unknown presence of wild animals, or
As a epidemiologist, I would say the missing information is one of the most crucial aspects because as also we could say, the surveillance is not always that good, so you don't know where the disease is, and sometimes you have to create like huge zones, even if the disease is just in a very small part of it. So having more data, more information would be much more helpful, but it's again, it's not very feasible. Otherwise, I would say for myself, I don't really care about the user-friendly interface because I rely to other offices, as you know. But I guess if it is something starting anew in another institute, I mean, they're starting to create a group, I guess user-friendly interfaces could be also very useful.
Yeah, moreover, there is a problem of trade-off between the dimension of zones, where you implement measure, and clearly also the trade can be affected, and the need of the producer to have smaller zones to manage the two components. How difficult it is, or which is the solution that usually has been chosen, at least for avian influenza.
Well, as you said, it is a trade-off with, for example, in the map I showed about the zone A, zone B, is actually also a trade-off with the poultry companies or with the politicians or somehow, and it's more the second one you said. So just a matter of having a trade-off, like combining the ideas, our ideas and our needs with the needs of the companies or of the region. It's not very easy, but it's something that can be reached.
Yep.
Paolo, from my experience, some outbreak in domestic animals is closed immediately, and these 3 plus 10 kilometers are almost useless. Most of the time, unluckily, these 3 and 10 kilometers are totally useless because the infection starts to spread, and you are always correcting your infected area and so on. So would it be possible to, I would say, forecast, I don't know, if there is some probability to eradicate the single primary outbreak, and so to limit the infected and protection area, in order to avoid the complaining of the people living in the other, and so on and so on. Or in some areas you already know because of the density of the farms and so on. So it could be this 3 plus 10 means nothing in practice, honestly. It's just for every disease, apart from vectors, for every disease, for every situation, and so on. So, in your opinion, modeling, trying to understand, there is some possibility or probability to better cope with these restriction areas in order not to kill the farmers around for the next 1 year, sometime.
More, yeah.
Just a curiosity from your, to know your
Yeah,
point of view.
I guess it's a kind of trade-off with the central. I mean, the European Commission, every now and then they ask also to increase the protection zone and the restriction zone in general. Actually, using past epidemics data, you could model and having this kind of threshold of distance and just draw around the distance the smaller restriction zone, for example, the kernel of transmission, for example, something. Yes, indeed. Well, probably at the time, but yeah, I guess for example, the big epidemic we had in 2021, 22. I mean, that was totally out of control somehow. But still, if we would have the ability to do some models earlier, in the earliest phase, probably we could have stopped the disease a bit earlier than that, or just not running behind the disease.